Good afternoon, and welcome to today's discussion, Free Speech, Where Do We Draw the Line? This is the third in a series of dialogues I launched 2 years ago to support the expression of a wide range of views on some of the most difficult issues of our time. There are two purposes to this dialogues. First, they put people with seriously conflicting opinions in conversation with each other and encourage them to disagree well, in a way that sheds light as well as heat. These are the sorts of conversations that sometimes happen at the University of Cambridge, where nothing within the law is taboo, and freedom of speech and thought and academic debate matter profoundly. You may find some of the views expressed tonight personally distasteful, but I firmly believe that it is better to hear them than to shut them down. We have the right to disagree, but not the right to insist that only our view must prevail. Second, the dialogues reveal how people find common ground, even people who, on the face of it, seem very far apart in their beliefs or opinions. If we are to make progress in legislation or understanding the world in which we live, we need to be able to identify where we agree as well as where we disagree. Tonight, we are tackling one of the most challenging questions of our time, free speech itself. Most people agree that people should be able to speak their minds within limits. The question then becomes, what are the limits? And this is a question on which people inside and outside the university hold widely divergent views. So let me briefly explain how this evening will work. We've invited 4 speakers to engage in the discussion this evening, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. Lionel Shriver, which is is a best-selling author whose novels include the Orange Prize winner We Need to Talk About Kevin. Born in North Carolina, she made her life in the UK in the 1990s. Her recent novel, Mania, explores the policing of free speech and asks, what if calling somebody stupid was illegal? She is a prolific journalist with a regular column in The Spectator and has written for publications including the New York Times, the Financial Times, and Harper's Magazine. Kehinde Andrews is the UK's first professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, where he led the establishment of the first Black Studies program in Europe. He is an activist and author whose books include The Psychosis of Whiteness, Surviving the Insanity of a Racist World. His latest book, published a few weeks ago, is No One Can Give You Freedom, The Real Mission of Malcolm X. Farah Dabwala is a senior research scholar at Princeton University and is currently a visiting fellow at St. John's College, Cambridge. His new book, What is Free Speech? The History of a Dangerous Idea, explores where our modern ideals of free expression come from, why we could never agree about them, and how we might think more constructively about free speech in the present. Finally, Joseph Webster is professor of the anthropology of religion at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Downing College. He is author of The Religion of Orange Politics, where his fieldwork among Rangers FC fans sparked a research interest in free speech. His work played a key role in repealing the Scottish Parliament's controversial Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, which banned certain football chants and aimed to curb sectarianism in Scottish football. We are also joined by the Master of Trinity Hall, Mary Hockaday, a former BBC journalist and executive, who will moderate the discussion. We will begin by hearing a brief statement from each of our 4 speakers on the following question. What is free speech for, and where do we draw the line? When all 4 have delivered their opening statements, Mary will launch a discussion among them. Then she will bring in questions and comments from all of you, our audience here in the auditorium. It's worth noting that this is not the Cambridge Union, much as we love it. This is not about rhetoric and debate and winners and losers. Instead, it is about understanding more, while at the same time hearing robust and honest views about a vital topic. And now, let me invite Lionel Shriver to give her opening statement.
Well, I will make quick work of the first question. What is free speech for? It is for whatever you damned well please. As soon as you start defining what it's for, you start defining what it's not for, and you have begun to limit it. I'm afraid that I am probably of the panel, though I can't speak for them. I'm just betting that of us lot, I am the free speech extremist. And for all I know, I'm going to be arrested at the end of this. I believe that it is rational to have anti-libel laws. It shouldn't be possible to tell untruths about someone and destroy their reputation. And we have courts for that. I don't believe in the incitement to violence, but I would clarify that that means real incitement to violence, not just exploding with fury, I'll kill you, or many other variations. And in the United States, incitement to violence, it really has to be a plan and to encourage people to do something real and actual. So I would say that Lucy Connolly, the woman who's been put away for 2.5 years for a tweet during the Southport riots, I'm sure we're going to talk about this more. I do not believe that she was really inciting violence when she just in the heat of the moment said we should just, burn all the asylum hotels down and with people in it. She was in an emotional state. She was not suggesting a particular hotel and telling people to show up at 10 o'clock. She didn't mean it, and she made it clear that she didn't mean it by deleting the tweet very soon after the same day. So those are my limits. And I came here today because I am very concerned that the UK is starting to lose a very precious right that it helped to establish, not just here, but in my own country, in the US. And we'll get into this also, but I think where the UK went wrong, aside from not having anything in statute that protects freedom of speech, as the US does with the First Amendment. But I think that bringing in hate speech laws was the beginning of the end. Hate is an emotion. It is not the state's business. And it is not the state's responsibility to make us nice people. So I oppose hate speech laws, and I certainly oppose what are they called? Non-crime hate incidents, which when I cite them in the United States, they think I'm pulling their leg. All right, let the games begin.
And next we'll hear from Kahindi Andrews.
All right, happy to be in Cambridge, where everything's a bit different from my university. I'll just say that much. But I was actually going to do, had a different opening, and on the way over here, I bumped into Sir Simon Woolley, who is the head of Homerton, principal of Homerton College, and I told him what I was going to be doing today, and he told me about the case of Nathan Kofnas. I don't know. I just read about it today, but there's a fellow who was at, I want to say one of the colleges that begins with an E. Sorry, this is how unprepared I am for this, because I literally was walking down the road and he said, you have to mention this case. There's a fellow at one of the colleges who was fired after Simon stepped in because he went on record as saying that if there was no affirmative action, there'd be no black professors, right? There'd be no black people in prominent positions, right? And Simon had to push for him to lose his job. Now, let's just think about what that means. When you say that I wouldn't have my job unless there was affirmative action, what you're saying is that black people are inherently inferior. That was the idea that made my people enslaved, right? This is not just a loose thing that we throw around. It is something which is codified in law for 300 years. My ancestors were actually enslaved. It's insidious. The idea that somebody who has those views could be teaching in a place like this, I mean, actually, it's actually not that it's not that surprising, actually. Unfortunately, it should be surprising. Someone who is actually having to supervise black students has the belief that they're actually innately inferior. Obviously, they should lose their job. The reason I raise this, and the reason that Simon raised it to me was he's now suing the college, right? Saying that actually it's because of free speech. He has the right to hold these views, and he's backed by the Free Speech Union. Now, contrast that to me. I got pulled into a police station recently, just last year, because I had the audacity to call. And if you may not have heard of Calvin Robinson, Calvin Robinson is a black right-wing figure, right? I pointed out he was, in Malcolm X's definition, a house Negro, which is actually just a description more than insult. And I was pulled into the police. Police knocked on my door, said, you have to come in for a voluntary interview. When I said, I don't really want to come in for the interview, they said, okay, we'll come back and arrest you, right? Not that voluntary, after all. So I got dragged out into, I had to explain my academic position, right? In fact, when I was walking down the road, I was going to bring my book. I was going to show my book, Nobody Can Give You Freedom, The Real Mission of Malcolm X. But I gave it to Simon because I saw Simon and said, I saw my book. So I didn't bring it with me. But part of the reason I wrote that book actually is because Malcolm X, somebody who used the term Ash Negro, Field Negro, Uncle Tom, sellout. I actually write the book to say, look, this is real speech. This is real academic work. Because I've been pulled into many as a expert witness of people who've been using political academic terms and been dragged into court proceedings. All that context to give you is that when this happened to me, I never got no calls from the Free Speech Union. I never had any support from the right wing, because it's actually not about free speech. What this is about, the whole free speech issue, is really about, there's always been lines. There's a complete nonsense that there's not lines. There's always lines, there's always consequences. And what's happening now is that other people who like me are starting to have a platform to start to draw those lines. And then people who would thrive in places like this, the elite, who previously could draw the lines with abandon and get away with saying whatever they want, now can't do that. And now we have this whole conflicted issue of free speech, right? The honest truth is that free speech has never been about protecting marginalized people. The reason I was pulled into the police station is because actually, if you think about the anti-hate laws that Lionel doesn't like so much, the 1965 Racial Relations Act brought in incitement to racial hatred. 5 of the first 6 people who were charged under that act were black and brown activists. Actually, the law on speech has always been against us. The idea that it's somehow on our side is completely and utterly nonsensical. This whole free speech issue is confected because people in power and the elite are losing a little bit of that power and a little bit uncomfortable. And that's what this whole debate really is about. And I'll end there. Thank you.
And next we'll hear from Farah Dabwala.
It's great to be here. I'll just put this up. It's very affordable. It's very readable as well. I think you forgot to say that. Free speech is an important and valuable ideal. It distinguishes free societies from unfree societies. And I came to write this book, or I started writing this book 10 years ago, when I realized that I believe that, and everyone around me believes it, and yet we all always perennially are disagreeing about what it should mean. And that's the case within our societies, and it's the case across Western societies, as we now realize whenever we meet an American. There's Lionel. And I'm being flipped, but it is a serious political problem in our culture. And what I realized is it's also actually a historical question and problem. Where does this come from? Why have we ended up where we are? I figured it out. Please, if you'd like to find out, you know what to do. I'm going to make 3 points in answer to the opening question. The first is our modern notion of free speech, which is that we all have the right to speak out on matters of public concern, is a fairly recent invention, and it's an artificial concept, unfortunately. It only works by minimizing or denying 2 basic facts about all communication. And the harder your free speech assertions are, the more you're forced to minimize those truths. The first truth is speech or writing, any kind of communication, is an action. It's intended to have effects in the world. That's why we're all here doing communicative actions. And mostly, of course, speech, writing, publishing is it's an ephemeral kind of action. But societies throughout history have also realized that it can sometimes be harmful action. Harmful either to other individuals or harmful to societies as a whole. And the especially Obvious examples of that are lies and slanders, untruth of various kinds. That can cause harm. Okay, the second thing that is problematic for theories of free speech is, as Kehinde alluded to, speech is always contextual. In the real world, it's never just about the words. It's always about, in terms of the effect, the meaning of what's done, about the speaker, about the audience, about the medium, about the intention, about what people bring to the words, as well as what the intention is of the author. And that's a basic fact about communication. We all know that. That's why communication is hard. Miscommunication is common. But it's a particular problem for laws, because laws are based on the opposite principles. Laws are based on consistency, equality of treatment, equality of status. And so it can seem like all you need to do is treat people the same for the same words. But there you run into difficulty, because if the Vice-Chancellor says something on the BBC, it's a different speech act from me saying the same thing in the pub to my friends. Second point I'll make, apart from that free speech is always an artificial construct, second point is it's critically important for our models of free speech not just to focus on individuals on the one hand and the law or the government on the other hand. What we need to do, and throughout history people have grappled with this and tried and failed and succeeded to move on from that simple model, is also to consider the role of the media. Who is amplifying speech? Who is suppressing certain speech and allowing other speech to be more widely heard? And in our current situation, that means considering especially speech online. Who's responsible for that? I put it to you that it's not just the individual speakers, it's the very powerful, greedy, rich companies that are amplifying this or suppressing this for their own purposes. So we need to look at that as a society. Finally, in answer to the actual question, free speech is not just one thing. There have always been lots of different varieties of free speech. Artistic speech, the speech of literature, scholarly free speech, political free speech. These are all slightly different things because they have slightly different aims. The aim of the comedian is to make you laugh. The aim of the scholar is to seek the truth. And because they have different aims, they also require different rules to make those aims possible. So in political discourse or in scholarly discourse, untruth, lying, willfully spreading things that you know not to be true is problematic. That's not really allowed because it's in contradiction with the aim of seeking the truth. In comedy, that's not the case at all. In comedy, your aim is to get people to find you funny. So that's just a trivial example, but we need always to think about free speech as something with a particular aim. And then we can think about, well, speech always has an aim. How far is freedom legitimate as a means of pursuing that aim or achieving it? Thank you.
And next is Joseph Webster.
Okay, so in order to preserve not only free speech but coherent speech, I'm going to read my comments rather than try and do it off the cuff. Okay, so I think the first thing to point out is the obvious point that free speech is never an absolute right, as we've already heard from some of the speakers, even that is according to the self-described free speech absolutist who, as far as most of us are aware, I think, generally recognize that there are indeed limits on free speech, particularly regarding incitement to violence and libel. It seems, however, more urgent and more interesting, at least from an anthropological point of view, which is my own discipline, to state that the current debate on free speech is made highly problematic by its focus on legal parameters, which seek to define and deal with the very narrow areas of what are regarded to be problematic speech acts. Is something hateful? Is it not? Is it inciting violence? Is it not? Is it libel or not? In seeking to legally codify what is and is not incitement to violence, for example, what is often being assumed is the idea that if we could only find a sufficiently variegated codification of certain speech acts, then we would be able to reach agreement and solve the problem, at least on a pragmatic level, if not on a principled one. As a social anthropologist who has studied how debates about free speech play out on Scotland's football terraces, my contention is that free speech is not primarily a legal issue at all, but is actually a social and a cultural issue. As such, debates about free speech need to be approached with an upfront recognition that humans are complex and full of contradictory behaviors that frequently defy legal codification and indeed logic more generally. People often don't make sense to themselves, let alone to each other. Facing up to that fact brings a new reference point to the conversation. To be blunt, my suggestion is that when viewed from the perspective of social anthropology, efforts to find satisfactory legal mechanisms to, for example, tackle hate speech whilst also safeguarding free speech is little more than a fool's errand. Importantly, I hope to be able to show over the course of tonight's session how this argument of mine is not merely rhetorical, but also grounded in empirical observations of real human lives. However, I want to end on a less blunt note, I hope, by suggesting that the debate about free speech, as it typically plays out in the public sphere, normally eclipses what I deem to be a much more important issue. Namely, how can I, as an individual, and how can we, as a community, seek to undertake a double task? Number one, holding myself, possibly holding ourselves, to high standards of speech, which places human kindness at the center of all that I, possibly we, say and do. Whilst two, developing the resilience I need, possibly we need, to live well in a world where such kindness is not always reciprocated. Seen from another perspective, this double task is actually a single task. That is, the task of being marked by grace, whereby I seek to speak graciously while also showing a willingness to be wronged by the unkind and ungenerous speech acts of others. A willingness crucially built on the clear-eyed recognition, and this is really important, that I myself frequently fall well short of my own standards and therefore have no right to expect more kindness from others in this regard. Thank you.
And finally, and this is going to be really finally, and then I'm going to sit down and stop coming up here. I'm going to hand over to Mary. Mary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Debbie, and thank you very much to all our panelists for their really stimulating contributions. And I feel I should say they have all written books, and they could all have been shown them to you. And if you go and search afterwards, you'll be able to find great examples. I think we would perhaps all agree that freedom of speech does seem particularly contested at the moment. Written about, spoken about, political football. We've had new legislation in the UK on free speech in universities, changes to the Public Order Act. We had an American vice president come to Europe and tell us that freedom of speech is being repressed in Europe, while meanwhile others accuse America at the moment of arresting people for exercising the right of protest or cutting funds for exercising the right of academic freedom. So we're going to explore this moment and try, as Debbie said, to shed light as well as heat. Farah, as the historian, could I come to you first? I mean, are we right to think that it's a particularly contested issue at this moment, or in fact, was it ever thus?
Well, it's always been a weaponized slogan, freedom of speech, just like censorship is a weaponized slogan that we apply to forms of regulation we don't approve of. But I think it's particularly fraught right now because we're living through this media revolution, we have been for some time, and our our established forms of communication and the institutions that mediated public discourse suddenly have been transformed. And what I mean by that is the online internet revolution has allowed everyone to speak. It's driven by corporations that on the one hand have helped demote the authority of newspapers and what they call the legacy media more generally, and on the other hand are imbued with this kind of American libertarian, very recent actually, historical notion that everything goes. It's the Shriver approach, if you like. And that's a historical moment that didn't exist before the 1960s, for example, when Americans also thought that regulation in various kinds was necessary.
Further back, it was often issues around the media that drove the debate back in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. Is that really new? The notion that media raises this issue of who can speak? And
not at all. I mean, the original context for the development of liberty of the press as a slogan and as an ideal is the early 18th century English context, where for the first time newspapers on a mass scale are engaged in partisan journalism. And people pick up on this slogan in order to justify what they're doing, but they always see it as limited. When you go too far, it turns from liberty into licentiousness. That's the 18th century model of balance between the two things. And we're still living in that moment, except our media had taken a different form. And now we have also the problem that these are not just national discussions based on national norms, but international problems because the media have become globalized in a way that hasn't been the case before.
I mean, Lionel, you accept some limits and you were very clear with us what those should be, but you said you want as narrow limits as possible and sensible. What is it that you worry gets lost if limits are too restrictive around freedom of speech? What is it you fear has been or may be lost?
Freedom from government. I mean, I think that, apropos of Farah's title, since we're promoting that, okay, free speech is a dangerous idea, but what is more frightening? An excess of free speech. People feeling too free to say whatever they think, or a government, and for that matter, a larger social atmosphere, if you will, that is oppressive and restrictive and means that you're leading a life where you're looking over your shoulder all the time, watching what you say. That editorial function in the back of your head goes overtime. Eastern Europe and Communist China and the Soviet Union, all the people who lived under those regimes know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not a nice life, and I don't want to live in those circumstances. And I would say that between being terrified of all these people saying things that are sometimes kind of mean, and being terrified of the police showing up at your door and hauling you into a jail cell because of some tweet you put on social media, I'm much more frightened of the latter.
You said that you were concerned that a moment of high emotion that led to a tweet, then led to an arrest. But why should emotion be excused if it leads to a tweet or an act of speech that may cause harm? And the riots, of course, spread beyond Stockport, didn't they?
My excuse for her wasn't just that it was emotional, but that it was not designed to have any practical consequence. That it was not incitement to violence as it would, in terms of the standard that would be required in an American court. Obviously, those are very different now, especially with courts in the UK. but she wasn't actually organizing arson. And I think anybody who read that and was familiar with the context, I mean, Farham talked about the importance of context, knows the highly emotional context of that tweet, then it wasn't really, it really does not reach the standard, in my mind, to incitement to violence. I think that's one of the reasons it's such an interesting case, because it does challenge that, you know, one of the two things that I said were the limit. But I think even within that world, you have to look at what the real intention was and what the real effect was. You didn't incite real crowds of people with petrol cans and matches. It was, what?
It did.
Not her individual tweet, no.
Are you sure?
Well, you're in context.
I mean, you sure?
Sorry, the context was that groups of people were publishing the locations of hotels where asylum.
Okay, but she was not. She was not.
So,
I mean, I am acknowledging that this is a marginal case, and that's why I
yeah,
think it's interesting.
interesting, yeah, yeah. Kendi, I'll come to you in just a second. I just have one
Although
other,
the punishment was excessive.
one other question, Lionel, just, responding to what you spoke about. You talked about, with admiration, the American system and obviously the Constitution and the First Amendment. The American and the British political systems are very different in many ways. Alongside that great statement of freedom has come through the courts an extension whereby a company can have the right to a free speech act, where political funding can be justified as an act of free speech. It's a very, very different culture politically to the British culture. Do you really think it can be transferred across? Is that what you want to see? Do you not respect the different weighing of individual and communal rights in this country as manifest in a different approach to the political structure?
I think the balance has gone out of kilter. So, yeah, I think that this country is veering. I'm not going to be hyperbolic and call it a police state. But, the police, six officers in several instances I can think of showing up at your door when they don't even go after burglars anymore because they think that, for example, in the Julian Folks case, he was writing a tweet about being alarmed at the possibility of anti-Semitism, and the policeman misinterpreted it and thought it was anti-Semitic. And so they haul him off to jail, and he's under arrest for 8 hours, and they tear his house apart. Now, that is not a country we want to live in, and it was not the country that I moved to in 1987. I think something has radically changed, specifically in the culture of the police.
Okay, Kahinda, I mean, you are somebody who've encountered the police, as you told us, in this space, obviously with concern, but I know you will want to challenge some of what Lionel has been saying. So for you, has something gone wrong around the policing of this and the legislation around this? Or, do we need to be in that place to have some way of limiting speech in the ways you would want to?
Let me just say there's always something wrong with policing in this country or in pretty much any other country, so I would not to defend the police in any measure. But I want to go back to something that Farah said earlier about what has changed. And if you think about what has changed, really, 50 years ago, Cambridge would have been white. All the universities, 95% white. Right? The media companies, they controlled what was out there, what was on TV. It's white. Right? And the thing that's changed is democratization of these spaces. You now have social media where people can say, I don't like this. I would have said I don't like this 20 years ago. There's nowhere for me to say it. And so now we're pushing the boundaries. Universities like this now have black students. So when you have a fellow that's talking racism, he gets fired. And that's why this has become a debate. Let's just be real. It hasn't become a debate because of the actual issue. It's become a debate because those in power, those who are comfortable, those who haven't, like Lionel, to be fair, haven't had those challenges, and now have the challenges. And like, oh my God, I've got to restrict my speech. I've got to look over my shoulder. You should look over your shoulder. I'll just be completely honest. The only real thing that's changed in terms of race relations over the last 40 years is that I will walk down the street now and won't be called the N-word. Whereas my mom tell her generation, they'd have got that all the time. And you know the reason for that? Is because it's policed. Because the government had to make a law that says if you call me an N-word in the street, you'll go to prison, right? And so without those laws, I promise you, I'll still be called a monkey whatever I say. That's the purpose of it. It's not perfect, but anyway.
You are celebrating the fact that you, and hopefully everyone in our society, is able to speak now. But you do want some limits on it. Can you explain to us more precisely how you strive for freedom of speech, but with limits that respect the possibility for that speech to be not limited in a way which you feel would be politically damaging?
So again, I think the idea of freedom of speech is a bad idea. It's a bad way to put it, right? There's always limits, and I think what's really being debated here is people agree on incitement to violence, although, I mean, in this particular case with the circle, it wasn't, the police didn't just come and lock her in prison. She went to court. There was a trial. A jury of her peers decided she had incited violence. I don't know the case well enough, but the idea that people have been dragged off the street and put in prison is frankly ludicrous. That is not happening, right? And these are courts which have, like I said before, these laws actually that I'm defending, strangely enough, were used against me and have been used against predominantly black and brown people. In fact, in the Southport riots, disproportionate use against Asian and black people who came out with benign things on social media, and they've been locked up. And you don't hear nothing, there's not a peep of the Free Speech Union, because it's not about that. This is about something else. So for me, the question, what this boils down to is, should people being offended, should that be restricted, right? That's what we're really talking about. Because if I can say, look, blackface on TV, that's offensive, it shouldn't be on television, that should be gone. And then people will say, well, you being offended shouldn't be breaking the law. Well, unfortunately, when you live in a racist society where we have to put up with all these things all the time, and it's not just about offending, it actually has an impact on my day-to-day experience, then yes, these things should be outlawed, and yes, these things should be moved away. You can say them, but there'll be consequences for them. I 100%, you can say whatever you like, but there should be consequences, which should be democratically decided, and the fact that we've got more minorities here is really the issue we're talking about. Okay. I mean, that's what it's about.
So I'm going to bring Joe in at this point. I mean, Joe, you spoke for kindness, which perhaps links a little to what Kahinda is talking about, which is thinking about the other and respecting the other. But tell us more about this particular case you were involved in, where, you know, on the face of it, perhaps a good intention to try and bring sectarian division, to heal sectarian division, but that in the end the law proved a challenging instrument to do that with. Explain it to us.
Yeah, so I mean, the context here for the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act was an attempt by the Scottish Parliament, specifically the Scottish National Party at the time, when they had effectively a supermajority, which was achieved despite the fact that the parliamentary structures in Scotland were specifically designed through proportional representation to prevent that from happening, allowed the SNP to push through this particular piece of legislation without any scrutiny from the opposition, because effectively, in terms of the numerical vote required to push the law through, didn't need to happen, right? They had such a majority that they could do what they want, and the result was a hastily drafted law which sought to ban certain sectarian lyrics within the context of Scottish football matches, and also in certain publicly defined spaces in town centres, on public transport and so on. And I guess my concern with that specific law is that the politicians didn't realise that in the social reality of football chanting, the most sectarian, the most kind of outrageously offensive sectarian football chanting occurred in the absence of rival fans, either in single spaces like a Rangers-only supporters club, or likewise a Celtic-only supporters club, or on private buses, or indeed in the football terraces where fans were strictly segregated. The suggestion in my research was that the most vociferous sectarian football chanting was designed as a way to kind of create bonds of sociality among a single fan base, not in order to offend fans of the rival fan base, right? Why does this matter? This matters because effectively what the law sought to do was make illegal certain words without realizing that the unintended consequence of that would be that fans would double down on the chanting that they were offering, would enact more vociferous sectarian football chanting within their own little bubble, and would perform super fandom by breaking the law, because they knew that certain words would elicit a reaction from the police. So essentially what the law did was it poured petrol on the fire. It was one of many unintended consequences. So I suppose what I'm doing is I'm kind of trying within reasonable bounds to extrapolate up from that case study to suggest that banning certain phrases is not a solution to the problem. My suggestion is not that we don't have a problem. My suggestion is that the law isn't capable of fixing the problem. In fact, it often makes it worse, which is why when Scotland then initiated a new hate crime bill, J.K. Rowling very publicly tweeted a series of tweets, which she, again, publicly identified as an attempt to goad the police into arresting her because she wanted to test the limits of the law. So there again, new legislation unintendedly makes the situation worse. So my suggestion is that the law isn't going to work as a solution to this problem. It will often make it worse, right? People don't cease to do things because it's illegal. They actually cease to do things over generations if you teach them that you shouldn't do it. Having been brought up in Canada, right, that the thought of littering fills me with horror and shame, right? Because I was taught to be ashamed of littering. So early years intervention, right, early years education will fix this problem if we agree democratically as a collective society what should and shouldn't be said in decent society. Banning certain words.
Yeah, that would be easy. But so far, yeah.
Quickly here, because I mean, the law is incredibly clumsy, and it creates martyrs to free speech, as Lionel epitomizes, all the time. That's one reason why it's a problematic tool. On the other hand, I just want to explain a little bit about what we now call hate speech, and it's the hardest problem of all. I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong way of approaching it, but there are different models that we can distinguish in the world. The one is the Indian model, if you like. It's imposed by the British in India because they perceive the colonial population to be childlike and emotional, and they can't handle offense. And so there you have a series of laws that anyone who feels offended may use the power of the state to attack their opponents. This is a disaster, and it's a disaster even now. That's not the case. That's different from the model we have here. No, allow me just a minute.
It's all defined by the...
It's not. Offense is a terrible, terrible criterion. Harm is the only defensible criterion, and the laws in other... So, on the other extreme, you have the American system. This is too hard. Laws are always going to be weaponized. We should just not worry about dealing with this in that way. We know there's harm. We just have to suck it up. That's the American approach. And you therefore are allowed to be anti-Semitic and racist and, broadcast whatever you like. It makes for a very different public sphere. The rest of the world is grappling with this on a different basis, and it comes out of the horrible experience of pogroms and murders and race riots throughout European history, and especially in the 1920s and 30s, and the experience of the Holocaust. And that is that we see that allowing unfettered demonization of groups is a dangerous thing in society. It can undermine democracy, it can undermine human rights. We need to somehow try and grapple with this, and the basis for that is considering the equal dignity of all citizens and groups in society. So what we now call hate speech legislation is always a political action. It identifies vulnerable minorities and articulates that they should be treated with equal dignity to the rest of society. That means it's incredibly subjective, it's always changeable, it's contextual, but that's the basis for it. You're upholding the dignity of these people who otherwise get trampled on, left, right, and center, by the free expression of whatever you like. And it's a problem. Is this a better way of dealing with it than not having any laws at all? I don't know. But I think we should be clear about the substantial basis for this kind of effort and the fact that it's based on hard facts about, throughout history, discourse of this kind has had terrible consequences. We see it in Myanmar, we see it in India, we see it all around the world.
We'll talk a bit more about offence and also self-censorship in a moment, but let's just think about protest, the right to speak freely, obviously very closely associated with the right to protest, and is also a right respected in this country. But we've seen, again, a lot of debate in recent times about who is protesting, where the bounds of legitimate protest fall into disruption of others people's right to go about their business, or indeed where statements of protest fall into hate speech. Is it possible and right, to put limits around what somebody can say in protest? We've seen a rise in anti-Semitic incidents, we've seen a rise in Islamophobic incidents in this country. A lot of this a response to Gaza. How do we balance the right to protest and speak freely at a very, very charged political moment like this?
Well, I think what's actually happening, and I think if you're saying what's the crisis of free speech, it is the fact that political protest is being criminalized through free speech laws, but not in the way that Lina would have us see it, but in the fact of pro-Palestine Gaza movements being policed. We had a whole ridiculous case of Maria Hussein, who went through the courts for months heavily pregnant because she had a placard of Rishi Sunak and Cruella Braverman as rightly depicted as coconuts. And this went to court, right? She was dragged through the courts. And we had in America, where apparently we have free speech, they're deporting people who are pro-Palestine. That's not, so even in the land of the great, I know, but even that, so it's not even in America where you say we have these protections, you don't really have the protections, because the actual issue, when it comes to how the law generally is used, is weaponized against us. And that's what you're seeing in protests here. So of course there should be laws that say you can't march through the street with white hoods on, shouting the N-word, or being anti-Semitic. It's grossly offensive and it's supposed to protect minorities, and a decent society should do that. But what we actually see is these laws are being used to actually police the people who are supposed to be protected by them. That's the real crisis of free speech, not the other side.
Okay. We've talked quite a bit about the law and the challenges and the limits of using legislation in this sphere. Let's talk about what several of you have started referring to, which is the social aspect and the individual aspect and the extent to which groups of people feel free to speak their minds, or whether there are concerns around not speaking your mind or self-censorship. So, Joe, if I could, ask you, and thinking about this from a sort of anthropological point of view, what do you observe in society and communities at the moment, and thinking even within, academia? Is this an issue?
The issue of self-policing?
Yes. Or a reticence about debate,
Yeah, I think it is an issue. I guess I would suggest that it's not unique to the moment. I think for a very long time, there has been reticence about certain speech acts. I guess as someone who's interested in the anthropology of religion, my mind immediately goes to blasphemy laws, which have been in existence for a very, very long time, and even before it was codified as law, in England in the Middle Ages, saying very specific things about the nature of Christ could lead to physical violence against you, right? If you denied the deity of Christ in certain settings, that could lead to very serious violence being subject against a person. So my sense is that this isn't new. It certainly does flare up in specific ways in academic contexts where there are concerns around, I guess in my discipline, anthropology, confronting students with case studies of indigenous communities which appear to show different attitudes to, for instance, gender and sexuality in ways that might be seen as contrary to certain contemporary Western attitudes to trans issues, for instance. And students, I think, are learning, as we all are, to confront these issues, both empirically and in a wider political context. And my suggestion is that we've been doing this for centuries, and for some reason we appear to be stuck in a sense, and perhaps every generation has this, that we, in this moment, in this place, are special because we are confronting these issues in unique ways that hasn't happened to humanity before. And my sense is that might be a product of perhaps deliberate amnesia or maybe megalomania, but the reality is that this is just a replay of very ancient debates. That doesn't mean the debate isn't worth happening. It just means that we might be able to have, I think, the self-confidence to look back into history and to consider how were these issues tackled in the past, and to realize that the task that confronts us is not solving the problem, because I'm not sure there is a solution. It's just the continual effort to grapple with the problem that is necessary. We are still looking for kind of definitive solutions, and I'm not sure that that's ever worked, and I don't see why it should start working now.
Pharaoh, if we sort of stay with this notion of offence, but think about it in a really serious way, the moments earlier this decade, or turn of the century, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, which led to real violence, and indeed attack on him and becoming, losing his sight in one eye. The examples of the Danish cartoons, which many Muslims took serious offence at, in the Danish newspaper, and again, 2015, the Charlie Hebdo magazine in France, again through cartoon, and attacks and murder of journalists there. So really serious consequences. So, this idea of offence, which obviously, we all as human beings think about and don't necessarily want to offend people, but these were very, very challenging examples when offence turned to violence. I mean, how do you think about offence in this context?
Well, violence is not appropriate response to offence. Let me just say that. But I think even though we can equally deplore physical and other attacks on Salman Rushdie, who's a brilliant and brave human being and a great writer, and on the cartoonists in the Charlie Hebdo case, I think those are very different cases if we are thinking about freedom of expression. On the one hand, in the case of Salman Rushdie, you have a man who is writing a novel, a man who's brought up a Muslim, who's grappling with his own religious inheritance and putting that into artistic form in a way that is intended for an audience in his country, the United Kingdom and other English-speaking world. And then, and this is an early example of the internationalization of the problem of freedom of expression, he is suddenly targeted by totalitarian, fundamentalist Islamic dictatorship in completely unacceptable ways. And he's exercising his freedom of speech in a way that is wholly blameless and I think unexceptionable, and we should all stand behind him. The Charlie Hebdo case is rather different and rather more tricky because, of course, no one should be physically harmed for their artistic expression. These are cartoons. But what is going on in that case, also in the Danish case, is harder to see in quite such simple terms, because these are people intervening, not primarily in a kind of artistically driven way, but really as part of a discourse attacking Islamic immigrants into European countries. And so really what they're trying to do is provoke, it's a political statement, it's, if you like, an attack on immigrants, and, they have the freedom under the law to do that, But whether we should accord it the same dignity of freedom of expression and so on that we do Salman Rushdie, I would disagree.
I don't see it as an attack on immigrants. I see it as the publication of those cartoons was a pressing against the implicit censorship of the threat of terrorism. And it's a preservation of a Western version of freedom of speech, which means that you could publish in a Western country depictions of Muhammad. Yes, it was seen as inflammatory, but without pushing against these implicit soft blasphemy laws, you don't have that right anymore. We've already got the problem where, would I be nervous about drawing a picture of Muhammad in one of my books? I sure would.
It's based on the equation of terrorism and Islam, which
Yeah.
is part of the difficulty of that
Well, they're not
as a
unrelated.
sophisticated political point.
We are in danger as we have larger minorities of Muslim minorities of instituting Islamic law on a soft level because we're afraid of them.
I don't think that's at all.
So Lara, you are. I mean, I don't know. Maybe in a way you're agreeing by saying that the nature of these cartoons was, provocative, was a political act.
It was a political act, absolutely.
But you
Not an artistic
are defending the right to make a political act, even if it is offensive.
It is a political act which is also protective of someone like Salman Rushdie. It is a protection of the majority's rights to do things that that Islam disapproves of. And if you don't push against that constant pressure to appease, you don't have those rights anymore, not in practice.
So Kahindi, what is wrong with talking about things in a way, being offensive sometimes, upsetting people? What's wrong with that?
Nobody's saying you can't upset people. But Lionel makes a couple of major mistakes.
Good, I do it every day.
No, I mean, come on. We're talking about France. France was not a nation state, it was an empire. And France had massive parts of the French Empire were Islamic. The reason there are Muslims in France is because they were governed by the French Empire. And what we had previously, before we migrate here, is that the empire was separate. So you can have this, we're Western, we're white, we can do what we like, it doesn't matter. And now we started to move into the place and say, well, actually, no, that's deeply offensive. Drawing a depiction of Muhammad is deeply offensive. It's not for me to say it's not offensive. And why do I need the right to draw a picture of Muhammad? I can go through my whole life without drawing a picture of Muhammad. It's fine, right? That's not a right you need. And so what is actually about, and Lionel's admitted, there's too many minorities, and minorities are having too much say on what is right and wrong. But to be honest, we've always been part of this. My family was British before they were here. And the problem was that we were censored, that we've been oppressed, we've been marginalized, and now we're having a voice saying, actually, you know what, some things are just too much. Don't draw pictures of Muhammad. Okay, what does your life change because you can't draw a picture? No, it doesn't. You should respect the people if that's what they're saying. And the fact that you now will think about it differently and won't do it, that's good. You shouldn't. You don't have the right to just offend people's religion because you want to. It's perfectly right.
I'm sure we may come back to this in the questions, which we're going to come to shortly. So, gather your thoughts. What I'd like to just do, closing the discussion, is ask each of you, recognising this is very contested, it's very challenging, as we've been exploring in, I think, a really interesting way. Is there one thing which you would like to see which would ease this moment and perhaps make it easier for all of us to feel able to speak freely within the law, but not to worry so anxiously about this as a very, very contested issue? Anybody want to start, or shall I just pick? Farah.
Oh, well, I've got a book for you.
Yeah.
But I do. But seriously, I think if we could just get beyond the simplistic slogan and thinking that free speech is one thing and it's just about individual rights, thinking a bit more about the title of this session. What is free speech for? What is going on in any particular setting? And acknowledge that communication is difficult. It really is. And communication at scale to large numbers of people is especially difficult. You can just give each other a bit of grace, as Joe so nicely put it, but also acknowledge that speech is an action. And think about whether, for example, in democratic discourse, truth is important. Truth and harm are the two touchstones for me when thinking about really serious problems in our political discourse. And we do have those, and this country is very imperfect in its laws and its practices, as all other countries are. We're all grappling with this. But we do need to keep those things in mind, I think, if we want to think about what free speech is for, how we might arrive at that collectively without just shouting.
What would you like to see, Lionel?
I would like to see less legislation, not more. The most effective and powerful form of control over speech is collective decency. And that's the way we really most usefully enforce, not calling you names when you walk down the street. I would say the main reason that doesn't happen to you very often, I hope, in this country anymore, is it's socially unacceptable, not because everyone is afraid that they're going to be arrested, because it's unattractive, because it is perceived as beyond the social pale. It's cruel, it's ignorant, it's embarrassing, and you would make yourself look bad in front of your peers. One of the reasons that I don't use a variety of pejoratives is not because they're illegal, it's because they're gross to me, and I would not want to hurt anybody else's feelings. That's what most controls our behavior, is that we have social bonds, we don't want to offend each other. I mean, that's the difference, is the Danish cartoons were purposefully offensive, but to a very specific purpose. But in the main, it's not an enjoyable experience for us to offend each other, especially face to face. I mean, that's what's gone wrong with social media. Yes. It's not face to face. And almost none of those people who are throwing this stuff around and saying really revolting things would dare say such a thing even to a total stranger on the bus. It just wouldn't happen. So I would like to return that power to the people and get it out of the law. And that's what I would do.
Thank you. Hinda?
I just say, Lionel, you have way more faith in people than I do. Because I'll be honest, the law is what sets the standard. The law, we talk about the law as something separate. It's made by elected representatives. It represents it's outlawed because society said, we elected a Labour government that said, actually, we want to have race relations legislation. Said we don't want the Enoch powers on there. And that's why you got these laws. And the laws plays a big role in setting the boundaries that we now say are natural. But without the law, I absolutely promise you, I'll be called the N-word multiple times. I don't have the faith in people that you do. For me, the main one would be to really see what this free speech debate is about. It is not about free speech. This is about people who have not had power, who have been unchallenged before and now being challenged and are now uncomfortable and don't like the boundaries. Too many minorities, too much this, we don't want to do this, I don't want to lose my right to draw pictures of Mohammed. That's what this debate is about. It's not about actually protecting the right to speech. That's not what this debate is about.
Joe?
I guess I would say that laws have unintended consequences, and they are blunt instruments for complex problems. I think the difficulty is bringing about long-term generational change, and it is very hard to intervene socially in that context after someone has reached the age of 12, 13, 14. I think behavior change is brought about communally and at a very early stage of socialization. And I think teaching the next generation what it is and is not decent and kind to say is a collective responsibility that happens in the home and in the classroom and indeed on the street, and is not something that can be reverse engineered through late intervention legislation in the context of my own research with men in their late teens, early 20s, who actually delight in offending and delight in breaking the law, because that is the way in which, in that community and in that micro setting, they make sense of who they are. So if you have a community who makes sense of who they are as a oppositional, defiant mechanism where breaking the law and offending the other is exciting and affirming within the community that they exist in, we have, in that instance, reached a point of no return that the law cannot speak into. So we need to then essentially intervene further upstream when children are much more malleable than drunk football fans in their 20s who enjoy offending the other.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. Questions? We've got microphones on each side, so we'll go this side first. Okay. Have we got a microphone on each? Oh yes, we have. Great. Yeah. So we'll go there, and then the woman just up there. Yeah, and then we'll do this side for a couple. Okay. And we want questions, not long statements, if that's all right, just so we can get lots of your questions in.
Hello, my question's to Professor Andrews. It seems your criticism is mainly that free speech or restrictions of speech are applied in like a hypocritical manner. So you were talking about instances where the laws were used against yourself. If that's the case, why are you not in favor of a more just like principled use of free speech instead of rejecting the notion entirely? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, like I said, this is not a debate. For me, it's not an issue of free speech. So the reason that those laws are misapplied is because the criminal justice system is racist, and that's a completely different discussion about free speech. The conversation about free speech for me is like I said, it's about it's white fragility. That's what it is. Like, just sum it up as white fragility. I would not put my campaigns to legitimize the thought of Malcolm X in my new book, Nobody Can Give You Freedom. I would not put that in the same debate discussion as the issue of free speech at all.
Thank you very much. This side, the woman here, yeah.
Cheers. Yeah, thank you for organising this debate. It's very timely. I wanted to say that, to ask, I'm aware that within the university over the last 18 months or so, there's been a lot of sense among staff and faculty of ambiguity around what is it permissible to actually say to students in the classroom about the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and maybe this could be an opportunity to clarify those matters. Thank you.
So none of us on the panel are here to, we're not speaking for the university or representatives.
Anything definitive about that, but just that I'm aware that a lot of people here, it will be on their minds listening to this. So perhaps the panel have something to say on the role of universities.
Thank you for reframing it. We can certainly do that. I mean, Farah, do you want to address this in an academic context, being able to teach, richly and freely?
I think only in very general terms. I normally work in the United States. I'm horrified by the excessive policing and clampdown on students trying to make their voices heard on many American campuses. And I'm heartened that in this country it seems that there has been more of a process of dialogue. And I think in any from the university towards protesting students, and this is irrespective of the issue, I think it's really incumbent upon us in universities to understand, that students are students, and that they are, secondly, prone to voice strong opinions on things that they feel strongly about. And we should recognize the value of their doing that, and recognize our position as teaching them how, or modeling how to do so in a civil way. So I think in this particular case, the right thing is not to start immediately talking about freedom of speech and censorship and so on, but to allow people to talk about what they think is actually going on in Gaza. And then to get people to try and articulate that from each side to each other and try and see if that can bring more light than heat, rather than shutting down debate, talking about the boundaries, talking about freedom of speech as the go-to thing.
Yes, so modelling listening as well as talking, and civil debate as an important aspect of what a university teaches and encourages. Does anybody else want to comment on this one? Or?
I would just say briefly that this is a good example of an issue where maximum latitude is useful, because you can avoid the obvious thorny question of whether or not, you know, is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic? You know, are you allowed to chant about from the river to the sea, etc.? Why don't we just let the conversation remain big and baggy? Because I don't like the excessives from the Trump administration in response to pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli protesters. I want everyone to have their say. Where I would draw the line, and I think that a lot of universities have, like at Columbia, is interfering with Jewish students going to class. It's not just speech.
Okay, thank you. Let's take some questions here. So the woman in the turquoise jacket and the gentleman behind.
The law has generally come in for a very bad press from the panel. I'd like to give a really quick example of where it did work. And then come to my question, which is about defamation. There's a case in Australia where a Murdoch journalist challenged First Nations Australian because they were not black. And he therefore said that they were claiming First Nationhood wrongly, and they won. It was a group defamation case under the Racial Discrimination Act. So the law can work for disadvantaged and minority groups. But my question's about defamation. It seemed that most of you applauded defamation, libel and slander, and seemed to think that it was good that it existed. But it's wholly class-based, because the only people who can take defamation action are people who have money, and it's about reputation. And who has reputation? People in the lower socioeconomic groups do not have reputation to defend. And women under defamation law only had a claim because they were being challenged as being prostitutes or loose women. So I'm not sure why everybody on the panel, it seemed to me, is applauding defamation law and seeming to think that it's fair. Why?
Anyone want to speak up for it?
I would just defend it on principle that you shouldn't be able to, heedlessly ruin people and get away with it without, paying a price. How it's executed is a different matter. So I take your point. Who has a reputation to destroy? It's somebody who's probably done pretty well in life. On the other hand, we can't have a situation where every time your next door neighbor insults your ugly hat, they go to court. I mean, somewhere there's a happy medium.
Okay, thank you. And truth is a defence in libel, of course. The gentleman there, yep.
Yeah. I would just clarify for Andrew that I ran the first Black Studies course in 1971 at the University of Westminster. And I disagree seriously with your approach. But getting to this issue, I really think that the whole panel, the whole discussion, and I'm afraid this is part of my philosophical background, I think there's fundamental assumptions that are seriously mistaken, that are shared by all of them. And I have to plead your forgiveness that what I have to say is longer than a question, but shorter than a statement, because uncovering an assumption is a little tricky, and I've tried very hard. the Coffnath issue is not a matter of free speech. It is a matter of you're not allowed to teach phrenology in the Cambridge Medical Department. You're not allowed to teach ghost theories. This person, if people had looked at his work, was incompetent. He cannot distinguish between a distribution and a mean, and he could have been dismissed for incompetence. But this was a distraction from the main issue. It made everyone's attention to focus on that. And the main issue is the racism in the philosophy department at Cambridge. Hume was a favorite of the slavers. Kant is taught as a enlightened person when he's actually the fundamental philosopher behind modern scientific racism. So what you have is a bluff where everyone talks about you mustn't say these things. I've had professors say Africans cannot think properly. I've had all sorts of statements. And white anti-racist students, there are much more white anti-racist students than black students, have been punished for being anti-racist, and they need to be protected.
Thank you. Do we have any students who have got their hands up? I don't want to be making assumptions about age and so on, but oh yes, there's one at the back waving effectively, and another one as well. Then yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm a student from the education faculty, and so I'm really interested in education. And we've all seen adolescents, I assume, which kind of went viral a month ago. So my question really is, what do we do when children and adolescents are exposed to extremist viewpoints online disguised as free speech? And isn't regulations appropriate when that happens, when children don't have the actual critical thinking skills and media literacy developed to understand what is hate speech? And I do doubt the ideal collective decency or the idea about teaching people not to do it is sufficient in this case, because it was exact Andrew Tate's argument that it's because of the repetitive teaching of misogyny and feminism that led to the so-called compress of restriction of boys' mental health, growth, space for boys, as Andrew Tate argues. So I doubt that approach will work by over-teaching not to do it. It's not like lecturing, Professor Webster. It's not so much like you're damaging the environment. But when people over-teach against identity, don't be racist, don't be misogynistic. Sometimes when people have the identities on the other side, they think that you are compressing their space for growth. So what do we do regarding that? Thank you.
Thank you. So, Farah, you raised this very current context of social media. What's your response? Regulation isn't enough, but would more regulation be enough? How do we deal with it?
Well, I think we need to focus on the power of social media platforms and ascribe to them an equivalent responsibility for what they put out and what they allow to be put out. And the problem is that most of these companies are American. They come from a very libertarian background, and that is also what handily coincides with their own incentives, which are profit. Spreading misinformation and lies actually is very profitable. And policing it in any way or shape or form is, costing money and is really hard and difficult and blah, 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 blah. But I have no sympathy for them. If they want to be giant profit-making publishers, they should take some responsibility. So as societies, we need to push back against that. And also, to the point that many people have raised, it's not about the individual in the middle of the night putting out a tweet. That's not the problem. The problem is these things on scale by corporations that don't care. At scale, sorry. So I think where we identify harms, and the exposure to children of various things is an obvious harm that we as a society should care about. We should make sure that those responsible are held to account. Those responsible are corporations. Laws exist to regulate corporations, and rightly so. Well, law is a very clumsy instrument, but it's politically important and it's practically important. We can't just do away with them.
Thank you. So I think there's another student just in the row behind, and then we'll come down here, yeah.
Sorry, I'm a weird sort of half student. I'm president of the Students' Union, and I was obviously keeping a very close eye on the legislation that was meant to be coming in last year around freedom of speech for universities and students' unions. And so my question is about platforming, of where do we find the line between people's right to freedom of speech and their right to a platform and a place to say it. I think that's particularly relevant for Offensiveness, of do we legitimise his views by giving him a platform at this university, and where does our duty lie to our students, both to widen their worldview and enrich their educational experience through hearing a variety of views, but also their right to be able to participate in that education without having supervisions from someone who doesn't believe that they are intelligent enough to be there.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Kahinda, would you like to take this and, your experience in Birmingham more widely?
I mean, one of the things when we think about it as freedom of speech, we miss the point. Like with Cognos, it's not freedom of speech. He believes that I'm inferior. That's not like something we can accept, right? That's an outdated racial science. But as my friend here pointed out, so did Immanuel Kant. We teach him all the time, right? So there's a much bigger problem.
Right? Platform for people to speak and who should be able to speak.
Yeah, I think the idea that there's a right for you to be invited to a university to speak is a crazy idea. Many people aren't invited to university to speak. We choose and pick out who we want to invite. And again, this is largely because student bodies get more diversified. People say, actually, no, that's not an appropriate person to come and speak. And that's how it should be. You don't have the right to a platform. And the people who are the audience and the students who pay for the place have a 100% right to say, actually, no, we're going to decide what the lines are. And if those lines don't fit you,
so if somebody's invited, if one group invites somebody who another group doesn't like, does that group have a right to try and stop the speaker speaking?
Yeah, they 100% do. I mean, I think isn't that how it should work? You invite somebody says we don't want this person.
Veto.
No, and again, it depends on the case. But some of the people we're talking about don't just hold objectionable views. They hold views which shouldn't actually be platformed. If a university is saying we are progressive, shouldn't platform views which are anti-Semitic. Shouldn't platform views which are, we wouldn't have Holocaust deniers on the university. We'd say that's not okay. We wouldn't have anti-Semites on the university. We wouldn't have the KKK. So you have to draw a line somewhere, and I would just say let the students decide where their line is drawn, right?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to do a couple of students down here, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close. So one here and then one here, whichever you can get to first. Yeah. So there, and then there'll be one there. Yeah. Right in the middle there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the issue of having like a generation, which is the sort of Generation Z, and then I'd also say some of the younger millennials, which simply do not have, at least, the loudest voices and the ones that dominate the conversation do not have the value of freedom of speech. Like, I'm afraid to be standing up here tonight and just saying this, even though I'm not saying anything specific, because there is a genuine culture of silence on university campuses now about this issue and about many issues where I feel like among the students, it is socially unacceptable to question many things that it is very socially acceptable outside of a university to question. Like, things that are debated in Parliament are unable to be questioned at the university. And I'm very concerned for sort of, quote unquote, the leaders of the next generation or this generation being completely unwilling to tolerate views that dissent from theirs and how we move forward from that. Anyway, thank you.
And thank you for finding the confidence to speak and for this hall being a place that you could do that. And we'll have a last question here. And then we'll go to the panel.
Thank you.
2 points.
So I'm from Abbey College, Cambridge, which is school for national students. So English is my second language, not my first. And I have a question for Joseph. You said adults must teach children's moral rules from childhood itself. But it sounds easy, and I agree with you. But what if some people find these rules, they disagree with these rules? And this is a real problem because this is, again, sounds easy, and this is good point, but many people have different views.
I'm just going to come briefly to each of the panel in turn for a last word, and you can choose either to speak to, is it possible to have moral consensus, or to, a concern about how to encourage young people to feel able to speak and air and debate.
Okay, so I think as a father of two young boys, I absolutely agree and accept that it is hard to teach children rules. I suppose my suggestion is that inculcating a culture of kindness and graciousness is actually not about rules. It's about trying to offer children and young people, and by extension all of us, a pattern of behavior which allows someone to think of others first, and to allow the individual to allow themselves habitually to take that backseat and to think, how is what I'm saying and doing affecting others, and to prioritize that. Was there a more general point that you wanted to make?
That's very, very nice. No, Kendi.
I would just say my experience of university campuses has not been some left-wing loony bin. It's been the opposite, actually. You find some deeply regressive ideas here. And in terms of change and trying to be progressive, that is uncomfortable. And you've got to embrace that uncomfortability. And the Gaza thing is a perfect example. Actually, this is a discussion of institutional racism, not a discussion of free speech. And if we frame it in that way, we'll have a much better understanding of where we are, I think.
I'm concerned that in the fad for no platforming and the kind of oppression that you described, a lot of it implicit, even in law, we are institutionalizing the pablum aphorism I grew up with: if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. It's the kind of thing that my grandmother told me. It didn't work. And that's because
It's said by the Bhagavad Gita that you should be truthful, pleasing, or someone should be beneficial. So I think there is some merit to what you say and how you deliver it.
Of course. And I professionally try to hone my ability to beneficially communicate, even if sometimes what I'm communicating is hard to hear. The trouble with if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all, as a guiding rule of thumb, is that if you, as in calculus, you take it to the limit, you don't say anything at all.
And that will be good sometimes. That will be good sometimes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the historian.
Well, I was going to say silence is sometimes an appropriate response. I mean, as an academic, I'm constantly in the public sphere being thrown questions to which I don't immediately have a very coherent answer. And I think sometimes we all just need to just step back, think a bit harder, and not just think that we all have the immediate answers to everything, which I think is part of the problem with the free speech warriors of today, who believe that everyone should just let it all out there, and that way truth will emerge. That's not how truth emerges. And for me, that's always. I'm sure I agree with you, madam, but I'm sure I didn't understand exactly what you said.
Thank you all for holding a conversation where very different views have been heard, where you have spoken and you have listened and you have engaged. And I'm going to hand the final word to Debbie to thank our panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming here. I want to salute our panelists. I think they were valiant, and I hope you'll join me in giving them a round of applause.